Good evening, and welcome to Mystery Stories. Tonight, we return to a quiet English village where nothing ever seems hurried, except the truth. In the watch that told the truth, a small, ordinary object begins to speak louder than gossip, louder than grief. Settle in with your tea, listen closely, and remember, in villages like this, even time itself keeps secrets. Chapter 1. The first sign that something was amiss came not with a cry or a commotion, but with silence. It was remarked upon first at Mrs. Grant's dining table, in the gentle way such things always were in the village. Tea had been poured, biscuits passed, and conversation drifted comfortably from the state of the roses to the vicar's sermon planned for Sunday. Then Mrs. Grant glanced at the mantel clock and paused, her hand hovering in mid-air. "How very odd," she said lightly. "It's nearly 4:30. Miss Marple, seated by the window, followed her gaze. The clock ticked on with dependable cheerfulness, its brass pendulum swinging as it had done for years. Outside, the afternoon lay calm and pale, the sort that usually seemed to stretch rather than hurry. "And Mr. Fenwick never misses his tea," Mrs. Grant added, smiling as though it were a harmless curiosity. Miss Marple smiled too, but she did not look at the clock. She was watching Mrs. Grant's face instead, the slight tightening around the mouth, the way her eyes lingered on the minute hand as if willing it to move faster. It was true enough. Harold Fenwick's presence at the vicarage at precisely 4 o'clock was one of those fixtures upon which village life quietly relied. He arrived punctually, hat in hand, shoes polished, conversation polite and measured. He liked things orderly, predictable. Time, especially. By 4:45, the remark had traveled. At the post office, Mrs. Allen mentioned it while weighing out sugar, her voice pitched carefully between concern and discretion. At the butcher's, someone recalled seeing Fenwick pass earlier that afternoon, though they could not quite say when. At the green, 2 women paused mid-step, both glancing instinctively toward the church clock, which loomed steady and indifferent above them all. Miss Marple, walking slowly home from Mrs. Grant's, noticed these small disturbances with quiet interest. It was not the absence itself that caught her attention, but the way people responded to it, the unnecessary explanations offered, the eagerness to account for time that had not yet been questioned. "Perhaps he was detained," someone suggested. "He's not been himself lately," said another, lowering her voice. Miss Marple thought of the way Mr. Fenwick had nodded curtly to her only the day before, his eyes distracted, his fingers worrying the chain of his pocket watch. A small thing. But small things often were. It was nearing 6 when the sound of the vicar's hurried footsteps reached her cottage gate. The news, when it came, was delivered with a careful gravity, as though rough handling might cause it to splinter. Mr. Fenwick had been found in his study. There was no need to say more. The words settled heavily, pressing down upon the quiet evening like an unexpected fog. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her hands folded, her expression composed. When the vicar finished, she nodded once. "How very sad," she said softly. "And how unfortunate it happened on such a peaceful afternoon." The study, when Miss Marple later entered it among the small cluster of concerned neighbors, seemed untouched by disturbance. Books lined the walls in precise order. Papers lay neatly stacked upon the desk. The curtains were half drawn, allowing the last of the fading light to fall across the carpet. Mr. Fenwick sat in his chair as though interrupted mid-thought. His head rested slightly to one side. In his right hand, still clasped, was his gold pocket watch. It ticked audibly. Miss Marple noticed that at once, not with alarm, but with interest. The sound seemed almost too loud in the quiet room, each second announcing itself with careful insistence. She also noticed the way several people avoided looking directly at it, their eyes sliding past as though it were impolite to stare. "The doctor says it must have been quite recent," Mrs. Allen whispered. "Such a shock, isn't it?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the mantel clock above the fireplace. Its hands read 10 minutes past 5. The pocket watch, held loosely now by the doctor, read 20 minutes to 5. A small discrepancy. The sort most people would dismiss without a thought. Miss Marple did not. She listened as voices filled the room, soft, overlapping, offering recollections that contradicted one another in the gentlest possible ways. Mr. Fenwick had been alone all afternoon. Or perhaps not entirely. Someone thought they heard voices earlier. Someone else was quite certain the house had been quiet. Miss Marple stood near the doorway, her presence unobtrusive, her eyes moving slowly from face to face. She observed how Clara Fenwick, his niece, kept her hands tightly clasped in front of her, knuckles pale. How Mr. Fenwick's business partner spoke readily of schedules and meetings, yet stumbled slightly when asked about the last time he had seen him. Time, Miss Marple reflected, had suddenly become a very delicate subject. When at last she stepped outside, the church clock struck the hour, its chime clear and confident. The villagers paused, as though on instinct, listening until the final note faded. Miss Marple looked back once at the house, at the darkened study window. It was not the death itself that troubled her most, but the way the afternoon had stretched, then folded back upon itself, leaving gaps where certainty ought to have been. Someone, she felt sure, had been very interested in the precise passing of minutes, and as she walked home in the cooling dusk, Miss Marple smiled kindly to herself, already aware that time, once disturbed, has a habit of revealing exactly who touched it. Chapter 2. It was said the next morning, in 3 different kitchens, and with 3 slightly different expressions of sympathy, that Mr. Fenwick's watch had always been a remarkable thing. Miss Marple first heard it mentioned at breakfast, when Mrs. Grant called in unannounced, her hat still on her head and her voice pitched carefully low, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Such a dreadful business," Mrs. Grant murmured, accepting a cup of tea. And to think, that watch of his was still ticking when they found him. Always said it was the finest piece his father ever owned. Never lost a minute, not in all the years I knew him. Miss Marple poured the milk with steady hands. "Watches can be very loyal," she said mildly. "They remember things long after people forget." Mrs. Grant gave a small, uneasy laugh, unsure whether it was a remark or merely politeness. By mid-morning, the watch had acquired a small history of its own. At the post office, Mrs. Allen recalled how Mr. Fenwick used to check it against the church clock every Sunday without fail, frowning slightly if the two disagreed. At the baker's, someone mentioned he once sent a watch away for repair because it was 2 minutes slow, and complained the entire week it was gone. Even the vicar, over tea served with unnecessary care, remarked that Mr. Fenwick trusted that watch more than most people. Miss Marple listened to all of it with gentle interest. She asked no direct questions, but she encouraged recollections with small, harmless comments. A nod here, a smile there. People spoke more freely when they believed they were merely reminiscing. What struck her most was not the affection in their voices, but the undercurrent of irritation. Mr. Fenwick's devotion to order, to exactness, had not always been easy to live with. He corrected people. He remembered appointments others preferred forgotten. He noticed lateness. He noticed everything. By late morning, Miss Marple found herself walking past Fenwick House, drawn less by curiosity than by a sense that the building itself still had something to say. The front door stood open, though no one appeared nearby. Inside, the quiet seemed thicker than before, as though the rooms were holding their breath. She did not go in. Instead, she paused at the gate, her eyes drifting to the study window. The curtains were drawn now. The light did not reach inside. A voice behind her made her turn. "I thought I might find you here." Clara Fenwick stood a few paces away, her expression composed but strained, as though she were performing calm rather than feeling it. She looked tired. Her eyes held a brightness that came not from tears but from sleeplessness. "I was just passing," Miss Marple said, kindly. "It's such a fine morning. One almost expects things to be normal again." Clara's lips pressed together briefly. "Yes, almost." They walked together a short distance, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. For a moment, neither spoke. Uncle Harold was very particular about his possessions, Clara said suddenly. Especially that watch. Miss Marple glanced at her. So I've heard. He kept it wound precisely. Every night. If anyone touched it, Clara stopped herself, then smiled faintly. He disliked disorder. Miss Marple noticed how Clara's fingers curled slightly, then smoothed the fabric of her coat as though brushing away an invisible mark. Did anyone else ever handle it? Miss Marple asked, her tone idle. Clara hesitated. Just long enough. Only me, she said at last, when he asked me to fetch it. Or remind him. Nothing unusual. Miss Marple nodded, as though satisfied, yet she filed away the pause. The way Clara's eyes flicked briefly to the house before returning to the path. Inside Fenwick House later that afternoon, the watch lay on the desk, no longer clasped in its owner's hand, but arranged neatly atop a folded handkerchief. The doctor had gone. The constable had come and gone. What remained was the faint impression of order restored too carefully. Miss Marple stood beside the desk, her attention fixed not on the watch face, but on its casing. In the quiet light, she could see what others might miss, the smallest scratches near the hinge. Not deep, not careless. The sort made by someone opening it more often than necessary, or with less patience than usual. She leaned closer, inhaling faintly. The scent in the room was not unpleasant. Lavender, perhaps. Certainly not the sort of thing Mr. Fenwick favored. He had always smelled faintly of paper and metal, and something brisk and clean. Odd, Miss Marple murmured. A chair creaked behind her. Mr. Bell, Fenwick's business partner, stood in the doorway, his expression courteous but guarded. I hope you're not tiring yourself, he said. It's all rather distressing. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Distressing things often reveal themselves slowly. Mr. Bell smiled politely, though his eyes shifted to the desk. Harold was. Precise. I imagine you've heard. Oh yes, Miss Marple said. Everyone has been most informative. He laughed softly. Then you'll know he was quite alone yesterday afternoon. He insisted on it. Did he? Miss Marple asked. Absolutely. He dismissed Clara early, said he had correspondence to attend to. Miss Marple glanced again at the watch. Correspondence does take time, she said, and sometimes time takes correspondence. Mr. Bell frowned, uncertain whether he had been contradicted or agreed with. As he left, Miss Marple noticed he did not look back at the watch, though his steps slowed as he passed it. Later still, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window watching lamplight bloom one by one along the lane. The day's conversations drifted through her mind, arranging themselves not by importance, but by tone. The pride in Mrs. Allen's voice when she spoke of the watch, the irritation beneath Mr. Bell's fond recollections. Clara's careful calm. Stretched thin. Timepieces, Miss Marple reflected, were not merely instruments. They were witnesses. They marked not only hours, but habits. Interrupt them, and one often learned who had something to hide. She poured herself another cup of tea and listened as the church clock chimed. Somewhere, she knew, the watch lay silent now, its story only beginning to unfold, and Miss Marple, her eyes thoughtful in the fading light, wondered who had been so anxious to see inside it, and what they had hoped time itself would conceal. Chapter 3. It was observed, with a certain air of satisfaction, that the village was being very kind about it all. Kindness took the form of visits, of course. Doors opened more readily than usual. Teacups were refilled without asking. Voices softened. Condolences offered with careful sympathy. Yet Miss Marple, listening from her accustomed place just slightly to the side of things, noticed that kindness did not prevent people from talking. In fact, it seemed to encourage it. You know, Mrs. Carter said thoughtfully, adjusting the sugar bowl as though it required particular attention, Mr. Fenwick wasn't always easy. Very upright, yes, but there are ways of being upright that leave little room for others. Miss Marple murmured agreement, her eyes resting on Mrs. Carter's hands. They moved with deliberate calm, but the spoon tapped once against the saucer before settling. I only mean, Mrs. Carter went on quickly, that he had opinions, strong ones, especially where money was concerned. Money, Miss Marple reflected, was often mentioned as an afterthought, which usually meant it was anything but. The condolence visits continued throughout the morning, forming a gentle procession through Fenwick House. Miss Marple did not attend them all, but she heard enough. She heard how Mr. Fenwick had lent small sums to neighbors and remembered every penny, how he had quietly revised agreements that others believed settled, how he disliked surprises, particularly financial ones. He changed his will, someone whispered at the greengrocer's, lowering her voice instinctively. Not that it's my business, but my cousin's friend works at the solicitor's. And she said, well, she didn't say much, but enough. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Such changes can cause a great deal of feeling, she said gently. Well, exactly, the woman replied. Relieved. People do get upset. Upset, Miss Marple knew, could cover a wide range of emotions. That afternoon, she found herself seated beside Mrs. Bell at a small table near the window of the tea room. Mrs. Bell spoke readily of her husband's long partnership with Mr. Fenwick, of their shared lunches and orderly arrangements. Yet when Miss Marple mentioned the previous afternoon, Mrs. Bell hesitated. He was meant to meet Harold, she admitted. But then he said the meeting was postponed. Harold rang him, said something had come up. Did he sound disturbed? Miss Marple asked mildly. Mrs. Bell frowned. Not exactly. More resolved, I suppose. As though he'd decided something. A decision made, Miss Marple thought, was often the most dangerous moment of all. At Fenwick House, the study had been left untouched, though the air felt different now. The quiet had lost its shock and gained a certain weight. Miss Marple stood near the desk, her gaze drifting to the papers stacked with careful precision. Nothing appeared disturbed, yet she sensed a recent interference, a neatness too deliberate, edges aligned more sharply than habit required. She noticed something else as well, a faint indentation on the carpet near the chair, as though someone had stood there longer than necessary, shifting their weight. It was nothing one could point to, nothing one could prove, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that carpets remembered. Later, while walking home, she encountered Mrs. Drew, who stopped her with a conspiratorial smile. I hear you've been very helpful, Mrs. Drew said. Such a head for details. Oh, I only listen, Miss Marple replied. Well, listening can be dangerous, Mrs. Drew said lightly. Did you know Harold was convinced someone had been in his study the night before he died? Miss Marple paused. I did not. Yes, he mentioned it at supper. Said a drawer wasn't quite right. Of course, I told him he was imagining things. But he didn't laugh. Did he say who he suspected? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Drew shook her head. Only that he would deal with it. Those were his words. Miss Marple thanked her and walked on, her steps unhurried. Deal with it. The phrase carried a finality that sat uneasily beside memories of a quiet afternoon. That evening, Clara Fenwick called at Miss Marple's cottage. She looked more composed than before, though the strain remained, etched lightly around her eyes. I thought you might like to know, Clara said, once seated, that Uncle Harold was planning to make arrangements. Changes. He told me so himself. Arrangements can mean many things, Miss Marple said kindly. Clara's smile flickered. Yes, I suppose they can. They spoke for a time of ordinary matters. Of letters to be written, of visitors expected. Yet beneath it all, Miss Marple sensed an unspoken urgency. Clara spoke quickly, as though filling silence before it could ask questions. When she left, Miss Marple noticed the way she glanced back once, her gaze lingering on the cottage door as though measuring what had been said and what had not. The church clock chimed 8 as Miss Marple settled by her window once more. The village lay calm, lamplit, and orderly. Yet beneath that calm, she felt the careful shifting of stories, the gentle adjustment of truths. Someone, she was certain, had been very much aware of time that afternoon. Someone had waited, had watched, had chosen a moment. And Miss Marple, listening to the steady ticking of her own small clock, wondered who had been most afraid of what Mr. Fenwick intended to set in order. Chapter 4. It was remarked later that no one could quite agree on the hour. The doctor had given his opinion, of course, with professional calm and careful phrasing, but the village treated it less as a certainty and more as a suggestion. People repeated the time of death as they pleased, adjusting it to fit recollection, convenience, or comfort. Miss Marple noticed this at once, for nothing unsettles a village more quietly than uncertainty about time. She first heard the disagreement at the baker's, where two women stood waiting for change. "Just after 5, they say," one remarked. No, said the other. It was earlier than that, closer to 4:30. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Both women spoke with confidence. Neither had been there. Time, she reflected, was very easily borrowed. Later that morning, she found herself invited, almost pressed, to call at Fenwick House again. The constable had finished his formalities, and the house was open to those with business or sympathy. Miss Marple went, not out of curiosity, but because places often remembered what people forgot. The study looked much as it had before, though something indefinable had shifted. The air was cleaner, for one thing, as though the room had been aired with determination. The desk gleamed faintly, its surface cleared of dust that had not troubled anyone the day before. Too careful, Miss Marple thought. She approached the mantel and examined the clock once more. It was wound fully now, its tick steady and reassuring. She compared it, as she had before, with the pocket watch resting nearby. The difference remained. It was not large, barely noticeable unless one was looking for it. But Miss Marple had long believed that large deceptions were built from small ones repeated faithfully. She did not touch the watch. Instead, she watched it. The second hand moved smoothly, obediently, as though nothing unusual had ever occurred. Yet she knew better. At the doorway, Clara Fenwick hovered, uncertain whether to enter or retreat. She wore a pale dress today, the sort chosen deliberately to suggest calm. Miss Marple noticed how her gaze darted first to the desk, then to the clock, before finally settling on Miss Marple herself. "I hope you don't mind," Clara said quickly. "I thought I'd see if you needed anything." "That's very kind," Miss Marple replied. "I was just admiring how orderly everything looks." Clara swallowed. "Uncle Harold liked things that way." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "though sometimes order can be adjusted." Clara laughed softly, a sound that came a fraction too late. "I suppose so." They stood together in silence for a moment, the ticking filling the space between them. "You know," Clara said, her voice light but hurried. The doctor mentioned the time. "He said it was approximate, of course. One can never be exact about such things." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Time can be most imprecise when one wishes it otherwise." Clara turned toward her sharply, then forced another smile. "I'm sure it will all be sorted out." Miss Marple watched her leave, noting the speed of her steps, the way her hand brushed the edge of the doorframe as though to steady herself. Once alone, Miss Marple moved slowly around the room. Her attention drifted downward, to the carpet near the chair where Mr. Fenwick had been found. The faint indentation she had noticed before was still visible in the right light. She bent slightly, examining it from another angle. The mark suggested not a fall, but standing, waiting. She straightened, her thoughts interrupted by voices outside the window. Two women stood in the garden, their heads bent together. I always said he was suspicious. One whispered. Kept notes about everything. Dates. Times. Well, that's what worries me, the other replied. What if he wrote something down? Miss Marple stepped back from the window quietly. Notes, times, observations. Mr. Fenwick had not trusted memory alone. That much was clear. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the library, where she knew conversation flowed more freely than books. She selected a volume she had no intention of reading, and seated herself within comfortable hearing distance of the large table near the windows. Mrs. Drew was there, speaking in low tones to another woman. He said the hour didn't make sense, Mrs. Drew murmured. Just the night before. Said something had happened that couldn't be explained. Men say all sorts of things, her companion replied. Yes, but Harold Fenwick wasn't the sort to speak without reason. Miss Marple turned a page slowly. An hour that didn't exist. The phrase echoed in her mind, though no one had spoken it aloud. When she returned home later, she paused at her own clock, adjusting it by the smallest amount. She disliked inaccuracies, but she disliked unexplained ones more. She poured herself tea and sat quietly, reviewing the day as she always did. Not in events, but in impressions. The way people corrected one another about the time. The eagerness to anchor the afternoon firmly in memory. The subtle relief some displayed when a later hour was suggested. Someone, she felt sure, had needed an earlier time. As dusk fell, a knock came at her door. Mr. Bell stood there, his hat in his hands, his expression uneasy. I hope I'm not intruding, he said. Not at all, Miss Marple replied. Please come in. He declined tea, pacing slightly instead. I've been thinking about yesterday, about when I last spoke to Harold. And when was that? Miss Marple asked. Just before 4, he said promptly. Too promptly. He was quite himself. And after that? Mr. Bell hesitated. I assumed he was alone. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. Assumptions can be very useful, she said. Until they are not, he laughed weakly. You have a way of putting things... Yes, Miss Marple agreed. I've noticed, after he left, she sat very still. Mr. Bell's certainty had been too smooth, his memory too conveniently aligned with the watch's time rather than the clock's. The church clock chimed 9. Miss Marple listened carefully, counting each stroke. Time, she reflected, was being shaped, pressed gently into place by many hands, and as the sound faded into the night, Miss Marple felt certain that one particular hour, an hour that should have existed but did not, held the quiet answer to everything that had gone wrong. Chapter 5. It was during the pouring of tea that Miss Marple noticed the tremor. The cups had been set out neatly at the vicarage, the familiar blue pattern catching the light from the tall windows. Conversation drifted easily, as it always did there, through parish matters and small domestic concerns. Yet as Mrs. Bell lifted the teapot, her hand shook. Just once. A brief hesitation before the stream of tea steadied itself again. I expect we're all rather tired, Mrs. Bell said at once, smiling too brightly. These past days have been such a strain. Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. Of course, it does make one careless with little things. Mrs. Bell's eyes flickered to her face, then away again. Careless. Or careful in the wrong moments. Miss Marple sipped her tea and listened. Talk turned, as it inevitably did, to arrangements. There were letters to be sent, accounts to be settled, decisions to be made. Mr. Fenwick, it was recalled, had been most particular about such matters. He kept timetables. He marked dates. He disliked being rushed. He always said there was a right moment for everything, the vicar remarked. Even unpleasant tasks. Miss Marple nodded. Especially those. Later, as she walked home, she took the long way round, past the station path where the hedges ran low and the gravel lay neatly raked. She paused there, pretending to examine a notice posted near the gate. In truth, she was reading the train times pinned beside it. The afternoon service from the neighboring town arrived at 4:27. The next did not arrive until nearly 6. Miss Marple traced the times with her eyes, then folded the paper neatly back into place. A certain pattern was beginning to emerge, faint but persistent, like a tune one could not quite place. At the station itself, Mrs. Allen stood chatting with the porter, her voice animated. "Such a pity about poor Mr. Fenwick," she was saying. "He was always so interested in the trains. Asked questions, he did. Wanted to know what arrived when." Miss Marple waited politely until she was noticed. "Oh." Mrs. Allen exclaimed. "I didn't see you there. I was admiring how punctual everything is," Miss Marple said mildly. "One finds it reassuring." Mrs. Allen laughed. "Mr. Fenwick would agree with you. Only last week he was asking about the afternoon arrivals. Said he needed to be sure of the timing. Did he say why?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Allen shook her head. "No, but he seemed quite set on it." Quite set. The phrase lingered. That evening, Miss Marple called briefly at Fenwick House, where Clara sat at the small writing desk in the sitting room, papers spread before her in orderly piles. She looked up quickly as Miss Marple entered. "I'm trying to sort things," Clara said. "Uncle Harold liked everything in its place." "So I understand," Miss Marple replied, taking a seat. Her gaze drifted over the papers. Account books. Letters. Receipts dated and cross-referenced with meticulous care. "These are recent," Miss Marple observed, touching the edge of one page lightly. "Yes," Clara said. "He was reviewing everything, making notes. He said it was time. Time again. Always time." Miss Marple noticed how Clara's voice tightened slightly as she spoke, how she kept her eyes on the papers rather than on Miss Marple's face. "And did he mention what prompted this?" Miss Marple asked. Clara hesitated. "He said some matters had gone on long enough, a statement vague enough to mean many things." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Change can be unsettling," she said, "especially when it's overdue." Clara's fingers pressed flat against the desk. "Yes," she said quietly. "Very." As Miss Marple rose to leave, her eyes fell upon a small envelope tucked beneath the edge of a ledger. It was addressed in Mr. Fenwick's hand, the date written carefully in the corner. Yesterday's date. She did not mention it. Instead, she wished Clara a good evening and stepped out into the cooling air. At home, Miss Marple spread her own notes across the small table by the window. She rarely wrote anything down, preferring to trust her memory. But this evening, she found herself arranging impressions, as one might arrange flowers, by shape and balance rather than by name. The watch that had paused, the train that arrived at 4:27, the insistence that Mr. Fenwick had been alone, the eagerness to fix the hour earlier rather than later. Someone, she felt sure, had needed a narrow window of time, narrow enough to slip through unnoticed. A knock sounded at her door just after 8. Mrs. Drew stood outside, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "I thought you might like to know," she said without preamble, "that Mr. Fenwick came to see me the morning he died." Miss Marple stepped aside to let her in. "Please," she said. "Do tell me." "He asked about the trains," Mrs. Drew went on, lowering her voice. "Specifically the afternoon one. Wanted to know who might be arriving. And did he say why?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Drew shook her head. "Only that he was expecting a conversation." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "A difficult one?" "Yes," Mrs. Drew said. "He said it would settle matters once and for all. Once and for all." There it was again. After Mrs. Drew left, Miss Marple sat quietly, listening to the faint ticking of her clock. The village outside lay calm, lamps glowing steadily, doors shut against the night. Somewhere within that calm, a meeting had been planned. Timed carefully. Interrupted violently. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again with renewed clarity. If Mr. Fenwick had expected someone that afternoon, then someone had arrived. And if time had been altered, it had been altered for a reason. She rose and adjusted the clock by the smallest fraction, aligning it precisely. There were still accounts to be examined, letters to be read, timetables to be compared. And as the church clock struck 9, Miss Marple felt certain that the truth lay not in what had happened, but in what was meant to happen, and never did. Chapter 6. It was said afterward that the house felt calmer once the watch was put away. Miss Marple heard this remark twice before noon, spoken with faint relief, as though an unruly guest had finally been persuaded to leave. The pocket watch, once so prominently discussed, had been returned to Mr. Fenwick's desk drawer, placed neatly on a folded cloth and shut from view. Out of sight, people seemed to hope. Out of mind. Miss Marple did not share that hope. She noticed the change first when she called at Fenwick House later that morning. The sitting room was orderly, almost to the point of stiffness, chairs aligned, papers stacked with careful symmetry. Clara Fenwick sat at the desk again, her pen moving steadily, though the window beside her stood open despite the chill in the air. Such a relief to have things settled properly, Clara said, without looking up. Uncle would have liked it that way. Miss Marple seated herself quietly. Some objects do make their presence felt, she said, even when they're meant to be resting. Clara smiled, but it did not quite reach her eyes. The watch is where it belongs now. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. In the drawer, Clara's pen paused. Only for a moment, then it moved again, scratching lightly across the paper. The study door stood ajar. Miss Marple could see inside from where she sat. The desk appeared immaculate, the surface bare except for a blotter and a paperweight. Too bare, perhaps. Mr. Fenwick had liked to see his affairs laid out before him, visible reminders of order. I was thinking of closing that door, Clara said suddenly. The room feels heavy. Miss Marple followed her gaze. Rooms remember, she said gently. Closing them doesn't always help. Clara rose at once. I should fetch some fresh air through there, she said, moving quickly. It will do it good. Miss Marple watched as she crossed the threshold. She did not follow. Instead, she listened. The drawer slid open. There was a faint metallic sound, then a pause. Too long to be casual, too short to be deliberate. The drawer slid shut again. When Clara returned, she looked composed once more. All done, she said lightly. Miss Marple nodded. I'm sure they spoke of ordinary matters after that. Letters that needed answering, visitors expected from out of town. Clara's voice was calm, her manner efficient. Yet Miss Marple noticed how often her eyes drifted toward the study, as though measuring distance, checking time. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to linger once more on the desk through the open door. The drawer sat flush with the frame, closed neatly, yet something about it troubled her. Outside, the day had turned cool and bright. Miss Marple walked slowly, greeting neighbors as she went. Mrs. Allen stopped her near the green, her voice pitched low despite the open air. They say the watch is away now, she said. I suppose that's for the best. Such things can be upsetting. Yes, Miss Marple replied. They can. Mrs. Allen hesitated. Still, I can't help thinking it's odd. Harold never put that watch away. Not during the day. Only at night. Miss Marple looked at her attentively. Did he have a reason? Mrs. Allen shook her head. Habit, I suppose. He liked to see it. Said it helped him think. Helped him think. Miss Marple thanked her and continued on her way, her thoughts settling into new alignment. At home, she took out her small notebook, the one she used only when impressions threatened to crowd one another. She wrote very little. A few words only. Drawer. Habit. Timing. That afternoon, Mr. Bell called again. He seemed restless, his usual smooth assurance frayed at the edges. He declined tea, pacing slightly as before, though this time his eyes wandered the room. I wanted to be certain everything is being handled properly, he said. There are matters of business. Accounts. Papers. Of course, Miss Marple said. Mr. Fenwick was thorough. Yes, thorough. Mr. Bell swallowed. He kept things in that drawer, the lower one. Miss Marple's eyes lifted. Did he? Mr. Bell nodded quickly. Correspondence. Notes. He told me once. Recently? Miss Marple asked. Mr. Bell hesitated. I don't recall. Miss Marple smiled gently. Memory can be selective. He laughed uneasily. Quite. As he left, Miss Marple noticed he did not look back at her, but toward the hall, as though picturing the house across the lane, the study within it. Later still, as dusk began to settle, Miss Marple returned to Fenwick House once more. Clara was out. The house felt emptier for it. The quiet deeper. She went directly to the study. The drawer slid open easily beneath her fingers. Inside lay the folded cloth. The space above it was empty. Miss Marple did not rush. She examined the drawer carefully. At the back, almost hidden by shadow, she saw what she had suspected. A slight mark. Fresh. As though something had been placed there recently and removed again. The watch had been returned. And taken. Miss Marple closed the drawer softly and stepped back. Her expression unchanged. She moved to the window, looking out at the fading light, the village settling into evening routines. Someone, she reflected, had needed that watch again. Needed it enough to risk returning to the very thing everyone wished forgotten. Why? She left the house quietly, locking the door behind her as she found it. That night, the church clock chimed 8, then 9. Miss Marple listened carefully, counting each stroke, aware of how sound anchored time. Somewhere nearby, she was certain, another clock ticked on. Carried, hidden, consulted. And as she poured herself a final cup of tea, Miss Marple felt the tightening certainty that the watch, faithful despite interference, was about to reveal not only when something happened, but who could not bear to let it rest. Chapter 7. It began, as these things often did, with an invitation that sounded quite harmless. Miss Marple asked them to come, not formally, not all at once, but with the gentle inevitability of village custom. A word here, a pause there. By late afternoon, it seemed the most natural thing in the world that a small gathering should take place in Fenwick House. The sitting room prepared with care, tea laid out as though for comfort rather than necessity. People arrived with measured steps and composed faces. Mrs. Allen came first, clasping her handbag tightly, her eyes bright with curiosity and unease. Mr. Bell followed, smiling politely, his manner just a touch too deliberate. Clara Fenwick arrived last, her expression calm, almost resolute, though Miss Marple noticed the way she paused on the threshold, as though bracing herself against an unseen draft. Miss Marple greeted them all warmly, her manner unchanged, her voice carrying the reassuring tone of someone accustomed to smoothing troubled waters. I thought it might be nice, she said, for us to speak together. It's been such a trying time, and sometimes shared recollection brings clarity. No one disagreed. Disagreement would have felt rude. They seated themselves. Cups were poured. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, its sound neither loud nor quiet. Simply present. Miss Marple took her place near the window, the light falling softly across her face. I've been thinking, she began, stirring her tea though she did not add sugar, about how easily we misunderstand time. Mrs. Allen smiled nervously. I suppose we all do. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, especially when we rely on it to explain away uncomfortable moments. Mr. Bell shifted slightly in his chair. You see, Miss Marple continued, Mr. Fenwick was a man who trusted time more than memory. He recorded things, checked them, verified them. He would not have been content with vague impressions. Clara's gaze remained fixed on her cup. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, we have had many impressions, many assurances about when he was alone. Mrs. Allen cleared her throat. Well, that's only what people assumed. Indeed, Miss Marple said. Assumptions are very useful. Until they are not. She let the words rest there, unhurried. Outside, a cart passed along the lane, the sound of its wheels briefly interrupting the stillness. I wonder, Miss Marple went on, whether anyone remembers precisely when they last saw the watch. Mr. Bell laughed lightly. That seems a small thing. Small things, Miss Marple replied, are often the most precise. Mrs. Allen glanced at Clara, then back again. It was on the desk, wasn't it? Until it was put away. Yes, Miss Marple said. Put away. And then returned. The silence that followed was not abrupt. It settled slowly, like dust. Mr. Bell frowned. Returned? Yes, Miss Marple said pleasantly. The drawer was opened again after it was closed. Only briefly. Clara's fingers tightened around her cup. Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor this time did not subside. Now, Miss Marple said softly, the question is not why the watch was taken. That is easy enough to understand. The more interesting question is why it was needed at all. Mrs. Allen leaned forward. Needed? Miss Marple nodded. To confirm something. Or to correct it. She rose then, not dramatically, but with the natural movement of someone accustomed to being listened to. She crossed to the study door and opened it fully. The watch, she said, was stopped. Not broken. Stopped, deliberately, for 11 minutes. Mr. Bell's expression tightened. How can you be sure? Because, Miss Marple replied. It resumed ticking afterward. A watch does not do that on its own. She returned to her seat. Those 11 minutes created a window, she went on. A very narrow one. Narrow enough to suggest Mr. Fenwick had died earlier than he truly had. Mrs. Allen's voice came out in a whisper. Why would anyone want that? Miss Marple looked at Clara. Because, she said kindly, someone needed to be elsewhere at the real time. Clara lifted her head sharply. That's ridiculous. Is it? Miss Marple asked. Mr. Fenwick was expecting a conversation that afternoon. He asked about train times. He spoke of settling matters once and for all. He reviewed his accounts. He wrote a letter dated that very day. Clara's face had gone pale now. He intended to change his will, Miss Marple continued. Not at some future point. That afternoon, Mr. Bell stared at the floor. And he told you, Miss Marple said, turning fully to Clara, that he would no longer support what he had discovered. Clara rose abruptly. You don't know that. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. I know he had discovered something. Something he considered a betrayal. And I know he intended to act. Clara's breath came quickly now. You're guessing. No, Miss Marple said gently. I'm observing. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. She placed it on the table and unfolded it carefully. The watch lay between them, its gold surface catching the light. Mrs. Allen gasped softly. It was returned to the drawer, Miss Marple said, because it was needed once more. To be certain. To be reassured. Clara stared at it, her composure finally breaking. I only wanted him to wait, she said suddenly. Just to listen. Miss Marple said nothing. He said it was over, Clara went on, her voice unsteady now, that he wouldn't be silent anymore. That I had taken enough. Mr. Bell looked up sharply, but Miss Marple held up a hand. You stopped the watch, Miss Marple said softly, during the argument. You always knew how to open it. You'd done it before. Clara sank back into her chair. I didn't plan it, she whispered. I just wanted time, a few minutes. And time, Miss Marple said, did not behave as you expected. Clara's shoulders shook. He fell. He struck his head. I thought he'd get up. The room remained very still. You reset the scene, Miss Marple went on, her voice kind but unyielding. You placed the watch back in his hand. You left. Later, when doubts crept in, you returned for it. Clara covered her face. I needed to know. Miss Marple reached across the table and touched her hand lightly. The watch told the truth, she said. It always does. Outside, the church clock began to chime. each note clear and steady. As the final stroke faded, Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The truth, she knew, was no longer hiding. And as Clara's quiet sobs filled the room, Miss Marple understood that the final moment, the one that would end this long, uneasy stretch of time, had finally arrived. Chapter 8. It was the clock that spoke first, not loudly, not with accusation, but with a steady, measured confidence that filled the room once the others had gone. Fenwick House had emptied quietly, as villages prefer such things to be done. Doors closed softly. Voices lowered. The constable's steps faded down the lane. What remained was the ticking, uninterrupted now, unhurried, as though time itself had settled back into its rightful course. Miss Marple sat alone in the sitting room, hands folded in her lap, listening. She had always found that moments like this mattered most. Not the revelation, not the gathering of startled faces, but the quiet afterward, when truth was no longer resisted and had space to breathe. The watch lay on the table before her, its gold surface dulled by age and handling, its ticking precise once more. It looked innocent now, merely an object, and yet it had borne witness to fear, to anger, to a moment that could not be undone. Footsteps approached again, slower this time. Clara Fenwick stood in the doorway, her eyes red, her face stripped of the careful composure she had worn for days. She closed the door behind her without being asked, and remained standing, as though unsure whether she deserved to sit. "They've taken him away," she said quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That part is done." Clara swallowed. "I keep thinking, if I hadn't stopped the watch, if I hadn't tried to change anything." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "You didn't change time," she said. "You only revealed how fragile it is when we try to command it." Clara crossed the room slowly and sat opposite her, her hands clasped tightly together. "I knew he'd found out," she said. "I could tell by the way he watched me. He always watched people when he thought they were careless." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He believed attention was a form of responsibility. He said he was ashamed," Clara went on, her voice thin. "Not of me. Of himself. For letting things go on. For thinking kindness could replace honesty." Miss Marple nodded. She could picture Mr. Fenwick saying it, his tone clipped, his decision already made. "He told me he'd written everything down," Clara whispered, "that once it was settled, there would be no more confusion. No more arrangements made quietly. Arrangements. The word had traveled far these past days. "I panicked," Clara said. "I'd lived with uncertainty for so long. Waiting. Hoping. When he said it would end that afternoon, I felt the ground shift beneath me." "And when did you stop the watch?" Miss Marple asked gently. Clara closed her eyes. "When he turned away from the desk. He was reaching for the drawer. I knew he kept his papers there. I just wanted a pause. A moment where things wouldn't move forward." Miss Marple listened without interruption. Confessions, she knew, needed space more than questions. "He argued," Clara said. "Not loudly. He didn't raise his voice. That was worse. He said I'd mistaken patience for permission, that the truth didn't belong to me alone." Her hands tightened. "I told him to wait. Just a little longer. I said we could talk about it, but he stepped back, and I reached for him, only to stop him leaving." She faltered, breath catching. "He lost his balance. It happened so quickly." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the carpet, to the place where someone had stood waiting, shifting weight from foot to foot. "When he fell," Clara said, "I didn't understand at first. I thought he'd slipped. Then I saw the way his head rested, too still." Silence filled the room again, deep and unhurried. "I couldn't think. Clara whispered. Only of the watch. It was still stopped. Those minutes felt endless. I didn't know what to do with them. And later, Miss Marple said softly, "You tried to give them shape." Clara nodded. I put it back in his hand. I told myself it would make sense to someone, that it would all appear tidy. Tidy, Miss Marple repeated gently. That was his word, wasn't it? Yes, Clara said faintly. That's why it frightened me so much when it didn't work. Miss Marple smiled, not unkindly. Truth is rarely tidy, she said. But it is persistent. Outside, the church clock chimed the hour. Clara flinched, then steadied herself. They'll say I meant to do it, she said. They always do. They will say many things, Miss Marple replied. But intention is not the same as cause. That will be understood. Clara looked up at her then, eyes searching. How did you know? Before I spoke? Miss Marple considered. Because of the watch, she said. And because of you. Me? You knew how to open it, Miss Marple said. You spoke of it with familiarity, not affection. And when it was put away, you could not let it rest. Clara's shoulders sagged. I went back because I was afraid it would betray me, and instead, Miss Marple said gently, it did exactly that. Clara laughed weakly, a sound without humor. He trusted it more than people, yes, Miss Marple said. But in the end, it spoke for him. They sat together for some time after that, the light shifting gradually across the room. Miss Marple did not rush the moment. She had learned long ago that endings arrived at their own pace. At last, Clara rose. I'm ready now, she said quietly. Miss Marple stood as well. That is often the hardest part. When the door closed behind Clara for the final time, the house seemed to release a breath it had been holding. Miss Marple returned to her chair and regarded the watch once more. She picked it up, feeling its weight, the smooth familiarity of its shape. It ticked evenly, indifferent now to the turmoil it had witnessed. Carefully, she wound it and set it back on the table. That evening, the village resumed its gentle rhythms. Lamps were lit, curtains drawn. Conversations softened into routine once more. People spoke of weather and errands and the comforting reliability of ordinary days. Miss Marple walked home slowly, the lane quiet beneath her feet. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and late blossoms. Somewhere, a door closed. Somewhere else, a clock chimed. She paused at her own gate and looked back toward Fenwick House, now dark and still. Time, she reflected, was a curious companion. We believed we guided it, measured it, arranged it neatly into hours and minutes, but it was time that observed us, recorded our hesitations, marked our choices with quiet precision. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a final cup of tea and sat by the window, listening to the steady ticking of her small clock. The truth had emerged, as it always did, not with force, but with patience. And as the village settled into sleep, Miss Marple smiled gently, knowing that once again, it had not been haste or cleverness that solved the mystery, but attention to the smallest moments. Those few minutes we so often believe do not matter, until they tell us everything.